Guys, welcome to my channel. My name is ReadingBear and I hope you are ready for some more stories. And today, we'll take a look at some new entitled people content. If you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comment. And now, let's dive right into the stories.
The first story is titled, When Evil Mama Bear Tried to Restart the HOA. Now the neighborhood my mother's house is in had an HOA that was disbanded in the early 90s for the pretty stereotypical reasons. Corrupt leaders, misappropriation of funds, etc. I really don't have many details on it since I was very little when it went down. But my mother had apparently been openly aiming for a seat on the HOA council for years. So, she was really sore when the HOA was gone because she could no longer run for a position. Fast forward to 1999. Evil Mama Bear had been trying to quote the old HOA covenants to the neighborhood for years and insisted that the rules and regulations set forth when the HOA was active should still be abided by. Literally no one wanted to listen to her. So, my mother started putting flyers around the neighborhood that detailed she was restarting the HOA without their approval and would be its first new president. The neighbors ended up in an uproar over this and showed up to her public meeting. And there she was verbally ripped to shreds as nearly every single homeowner in the neighborhood not only denied their support of another HOA, but also made it clear to her what she was trying to do was not legal. My mother was incensed by this. And no surprise she didn't even have my father's support, which was something she'd initially been counting on. But he refused from the onset of her scheme. And when the neighborhood all refused to recreate the HOA, Evil Mama Bear went off on my dad for not being supportive of her. After she gaslighted herself into nearly being out of breath, my dad told her she was just looking for a way to lord over the neighborhood, and he'd never support that. She tried to argue with him some more, but he just ended the conversation and walked away. Somehow that still didn't stop my mother though. She went and contacted a sleazy lawyer about trying to get the HOA running again without the support of the residents. Her hope was that there was some sort of law that could reactivate the HOA on different grounds. The lawyer went through all of the old HOA documents and state laws over a couple of days and told my mother there was nothing that could be done as it was not enforceable, and that without the consent and signed support of enough people in the neighborhood there was no way to legally restart the HOA. Then proceeded to bill Evil Mama Bear for the time he spent looking through all of that. Since my mother hired the sleazy lawyer herself under the table, she had to pay him. But she hated paying anyone for anything because she was so cheap. Now an important fact of note was that my dad hadn't trusted Evil Mama Bear with his money for years and no longer kept joint bank accounts with her. And she had no way to access his money. So, she filed for a new credit card using his name and then used said credit card to pay the lawyer instead. My dad noticed a new credit card statement in his name pretty fast and nearly filed for fraud when my mother came clean out of fear. He demanded she pay off the credit card, and then have said card deactivated. My mother didn't want to, but he threatened to call the fraud department of his bank on her. I still remember hearing the argument where she tried to claim that he couldn't do that because they were married, and everything that was his was also hers. And that meant that she could do what she did, and he'd still have to pay. Dad called bullshit on that and said he'd contest the charges and get the card removed from his name, which would have left my mother in serious legal trouble for fraud and debt collection. And so Evil Mama Bear begrudgingly paid off the money owed. And my dad cut the card to little pieces with scissors. My mother had the money to pay the lawyer all along. She just preferred to keep her cash and put any expenses she could on my father. But he always stopped her, and she'd try to pull the shared assets logic because they were married. Though that ended when they divorced. Evil Mama Bear still spent the next few years trying to quote the HOA covenants to neighbors. But she was always dismissed or laughed at every single time she tried. A few people started referring to her as President Wannabe. To this day no HOA has formed in the neighborhood again. And even if one did, they'd never vote in Evil Mama Bear. I can only imagine what would happen if she tried to pull this crap in Texas after she moves there. Edit. I've had a few people messaging me that the lawyer I spoke of in the story that my mother went to wasn't sleazy just by association with my mother and just did what normal lawyers do. Well, he was known by reputation to overcharge people. And my own lawyer told me some time ago that he had first-hand experience with the sleazy lawyer because he knew him in person. The guy would intentionally take longer than needed to do anything so he could charge more time from clients. That among other shady things he did bite him in the butt some years ago and he shut down his office. The next story is entitled Neighbor Let Their Friends Build a Hunting Nest on My Great-Grandfather's Property and Refused to Take It Down. This is an old story that happened in the 80s. My uncle told me what happened only once. So, this is basically pieces together from memory. But in the 80s some people who lived in the local area just up and decided they wanted to hunt deer on my family property and not ask permission to do so. My great-grandfather, henceforth known as GG, was a pretty good guy. But he was not someone you wanted to cross. He grew up in the Great Depression and had no patience for certain kinds of people. That said, he would try and do whatever it took to resolve things on his own before doing anything drastic. One day while driving his truck through the forest part of his property, he saw a hunting nest built up in one of his trees. He took it down himself since the ones who built it were not there. However, a week or so later it was back in the tree as the hunters had rebuilt it. GG asked around and found out the hunters were not actually neighbors, but friends of a neighbor that was letting them come around to hunt on their property. And they had no idea that they were crossing over fence lines trying to find places to hunt. However, they also did not seem to care and didn't stop them from doing so or even tell GG when they were around. GG waited around for the hunters for days and finally confronted them. They were not sorry at all. And even tried to ignore him. GG was a salt-of-the-earth kind of man, so he tried to negotiate first. And since he had no contact information for these people apart from his jerk neighbor, he could not do much except keep them from hunting deer by making noise. This back and forth went on for months. Finally, my uncle insisted he get the police involved. GG reluctantly agreed. Police waited and caught the hunters red-handed trespassing. However, they still acted entitled to hunt on GG's property and even threatened to sue. However, the police told them that not only did they have no leg to stand on, they gave the hunters an ultimatum. If GG wished to press charges for multiple counts of trespassing, illegal hunting, carrying a firearm while trespassing, and building the hunting nest on his property, then they would more than likely go to jail and be hit with a big fine. With this the hunters finally agreed to stop. However, they tried to get away with leaving the hunting nest. But the police made them take it down as if they didn't, it would be out of GG's hands on pressing charges if they refused. So, GG got to sit and watch as the hunters took down the hunting nest piece by piece and retreated back from whence they came with it. We never saw or heard from the hunters again. I don't know how truthful this story sounds to everyone. However, this is how I remember it being told. The next story is entitled Neighbor Spends Thousands of Dollars to Try and Get Rid of Some Geese. This story isn't your typical r/entitled people story because it doesn't involve Karens and Kens bullying people to get what they want. My neighbors are really sweet from what I've heard. I've never personally met them. We live in an upper middle class neighborhood. Just to give you some scale, the adjoining neighborhood's houses easily go over 7 figures. Anyway, my neighbors own 2 lots next to their house that they use as a buffer between our other neighbors where they just tend to a bunch of grass and some small trees. A few years ago, when they cut all the trees down and planted the grass, we got our flock of residential Canadian geese that refused to migrate north. We live in the deep, deep south. The geese had been living pretty peacefully for years until a few months ago. For some reason when I was driving home from running errands, I saw not 1, not 2, but 4 coyote decoys sitting in their backyard next to the water. It should be important to note that each of these coyotes cost up to about $75, which adds up pretty quickly. This little solution to the geese problem only lasted about 2 days as the geese caught on to what was going on and went right back to being their sassy selves in the pond and backyard. My neighbors were pissed and started to move the decoys around every morning in their war against the geese. They failed. About a month later, I went for a walk past their house and noticed a pretty big fountain sitting in the middle of the neighborhood pond that borders their house and a ton of other houses, including that 7 figures neighborhood. I was just thinking to myself, how entitled can you be to set a fountain up in a public pond to get rid of some geese? I have no idea how they managed to get a fountain in when our HOA is like every HOA and is a nightmare, or how favors they had to call in from neighbors to get the thing installed. This solution didn't even last 2 days, and the geese returned. The geese were even bold enough to sleep right in front of the decoys without a care in the world. On another walk, about a month ago, I noticed another fountain was installed on the opposite end of the pond. This solution never worked, and the geese didn't even bat an eye. This entire saga of decoys, fountains, and war on the geese was hilarious to watch from my perspective. The same day I saw the second fountain, I hilariously saw one of the geese smugly walk up to my neighbor in his backyard and start honking and flapping its wings right in his face. My neighbor retreated and the goose won the battle. I looked up the relative price of the fountains and they range from $2,000 to $3,000. So, in all they spent just shy of $3,300 on this little adventure. I'll update if anything new happens, but it's fair to say that the geese won the war and peace talk are underway. Update. I'm moving in a few months, so probably no updates after this. But my neighbor has upgraded one of the fountains and now is one of those fountains you would see at a resort or golf course. I would know because I worked at a golf course for 2 years. For now, there aren't any geese, but who knows? If they come back, I'll let you know. The next story is titled, Shitty Neighbor Replaces Sweet Old Couple. On New Year's Day, the old couple next door moved out and I was quite sad. But thought the next ones would be okay. I was wrong. Our first encounter with our neighbors was when a cat late at night was meowing at our window in the frigid cold. This was January in Wisconsin, USA. My mom reluctantly let us take him inside for the night and we would ask around the neighborhood the next morning. We put him in the laundry room with food, a bed, a blanket, some water, and an old litter box we had in storage. Next morning comes around and I ask around. Lo and behold, the new neighbors say that's their cat and he's an outdoor cat. Okay, I guess that's reasonable. But why was he out at 10 p.m. when it's like 13 degrees outside? Nothing happened for a while, and we saw her being a Karen to the neighbors across the street. She was yelling about the neighbors' dogs barking all the time. During the day specifically. Just want to point out that the new neighbors' dogs are barking literally 24/7, including super late at night. Next encounter was when me and my mom were out planting milkweed plants for the summer because we raise monarch butterflies each summer with the help of our neighbor. Halfway through the planting, the neighbors let their dogs out and they came running for us. Luckily, they have a fence, but the German Shepherd they have could break that fence down at any time if it wanted. Why, you may ask? This fence is the fence the sweet old couple used when they lived here. The dog they had was this tiny little Bichon named Quincy. It was made for a tiny dog. German Shepherds aren't tiny. And to top it all off, when the German Shepherd wouldn't stop barking, the neighbor came over and slapped the dog in the face really hard. Her excuse for that and yelling at the neighbor was that she lost her job. Bullshit excuse isn't an excuse to slap your damn dog. Lastly, barely a week into June and the neighbors randomly start setting off probably illegal fireworks. And they were loud. Like this crap sounded 10 times the sound of a gunshot. I felt the ducking earth shake from inside my room. Imagine what it sounded like outside. Now, my neighborhood is usually a very quiet one, so barely 5 minutes into this and the cops are already at the door scolding her dumbass. Hasn't happened since, but I have heard quite a lot of fireworks, granted not as loud, starting around a week before now. So yeah, that's all the stories I have of my entitled neighbor that replaced the sweet old couple everyone loved. If this blows up, I'll tell more stories of my entitled neighbor when they happen. Good night, don't let the nice neighbors leave. The next story is titled, Ambulance in the Way. My elderly mother lives with me because she can no longer care for herself. It's usually not a big deal, but she's been really sick the last few days and last night she had a seizure and then passed out. I called 911 and then had my sister come over since she has medical power of attorney. They both arrive at close to the same time and the paramedics asked if I could clear a path in the snow for the stretcher in case they need to take mom to the hospital. So just about the time I finish doing that, one of them comes out of the house to get the stretcher. He tells me what's going, which is really nice because I'm sure he just got done telling my sister inside all the same info, at which point a car pulls up behind the ambulance. It's my idiot neighbor that lives a few houses down. Due to the snowstorm that we had this week, the plows cleared just enough that our road is pretty much just one lane at the moment. So, he stops, gets out and asks the EMT if he can move the ambulance. The EMT looks shocked and takes a moment to collect himself before saying, "We have an emergency. We're working on someone right now." Now while most people would never have asked the ambulance to move in the first place, the few who do would be shamed after the answer given by the EMT. Not this jackass. He doubles down and asks, "Well, how long is it going to take?" The EMT didn't even respond, just went back to what he was doing. My neighbor puts his car in reverse and backs up as fast he can. Really smart on a snow-packed road. Anyway, it's still about half an hour before they load my mother into the ambulance, and they take her to the hospital. I have no idea when or even if my neighbor made it home. The next story is titled, Neighbors Mistook Me for a Grocery Store. This took place several years ago, long before COVID, when I was a struggling single mom. My daughter was in her mid-teens and she and I lived in an apartment that wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was our home and we made it work. The cast of the story were my next-door neighbors. There was a mom with 2 kids, and she was pregnant with her third. She was young and a bit uneducated, but very sweet, and I used to make conversation with her from time to time from our balconies. Her boyfriend was a piece of work. He came and went as he pleased, was often inebriated on God knows what, and didn't have a job. Once he realized I was friendly with his girlfriend, his entitlement began. It started small at first. Do you have an egg we could borrow? We need it for the recipe, and it looks like we're out. Do you have a few napkins? The asks were small at first, but they started to happen on a near daily basis. I finally told him, look dude, I don't live in this neighborhood because I'm rolling in money. I don't mind helping in an emergency, but I can't be helping every day. That's when he started sending his 6-year-old to ask, do you know how difficult it is saying no to a kid? It was especially hard for my daughter, who was often the one to answer the door. The final straw was the maple syrup. My daughter answered one day to see the doe-eyed 6-year-old asking to borrow our maple syrup. She handed it over before I realized what was happening. 4 days later the kid came back asking to borrow our syrup again. I told him they should already have it as they never gave mine back. A few minutes later Dad comes knocking. He asks again for maple syrup. I tell him, you have my maple syrup. You borrowed it 4 days ago and never returned it. He said, we used it all. We need more. I said, well, I don't have more. This dude dead-ass said, don't you ever go shopping? I lost it, don't you? And slammed the door in his face. I told my daughter I don't give a duck what they ask for, or who asks for it. They are never to get shit from us again. I don't care if they are on fire begging for water. Don't even bother answering the door. That family is the epitome of entitled. Mom was no better, but that's a story for another day. I am so glad I moved out of that neighborhood. The last story is titled, EP Terrorizes Our Neighbors. This is an ongoing thing. My block is a pretty distinct square with streets all around, and we all know each other at varying levels of friendliness. On the street to our right, there are 2 households important here, the Smiths and EPs, not real names. The Smiths are a lovely household with a youngish couple, a sweet daughter, and 2 cats. The Smith family has been here for a few years, and we've adored them. I even occasionally cat-sit for them, they pay excellently. This is just to establish how nice and lovely they are. EP, directly next door, is a very old lady that lives alone. I had been told my whole life she was crazy but wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Sure, she had that slight weirdness that a lot of older people can have, which I won't mention since they aren't relevant. What is relevant is that EP absolutely hates the Smiths. I first heard of her insisting that part of the Smiths' property was hers. In fact, she actually already is using part of their property. Then, from my mom and then the mom of the Smiths, the sidewalk incidents. EP started to leave things, like garden tools, on the sidewalk in front of her house while the mom and daughter were out to try and deliberately injure them. They even had video proof. I do not have, nor would I ever share it, that EP was doing it completely on purpose. The most recent incident was when EP took an electric scooter that had been left near her house and threw it into Smith's bushes. And yet, there's still one last part. There was a different family in the Smith's house before them that I never really met. EP must really hate that house because she called CPS on them, unprompted. And of course, nothing was found. Thanks for listening.